So, what's the story with this quote Chinese spy balloon? Well, personally, I think it's a big nothing burger, mainly because this isn't the first time this has happened. Before I get into that, a little background. So, the US scrambled fighter jets to monitor a situation in which a large spy balloon flew over Montana, specifically over nuclear sites in Montana. This led to a series of diplomatic discussions between Beijing and the U.S. and ultimately led to Anthony Blinken postponing his trip to Beijing because the U.S. sees it as a violation of its sovereignty. The U.S. is tracking the balloon and we're prepared to shoot it down. However, citing the danger to people on ground, they aren't going to shoot it down. More than likely, they're going to collect information on it. The fact that the U.S. hasn't shot it down means that they're probably trying to collect information in real time, as well as when it does inevitably come down, collect from what they recover. Now, the U.S. has actually stopped discussing specifically the balloon's actual location and just kind of sarcastically say, if you want to know where the balloon is, look up. That either tells me one of two things. Either it doesn't matter, the U.S. doesn't really care, doesn't see it as a military threat, which they've said it's not a military threat, or they are saying we're doing everything that's necessary, don't worry about it, and we're using it as a collection effort ourselves. Now, the U.S. has said they're taking measures to prevent collection on whatever sites the balloon has flown over. Now, some people are saying they could be scooping signals intelligence. In other words, they're looking at our cell phone traffic, our radio traffic, but a lot of that can be done from the ground too. Yes, Montana and nearby states are home to U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile silos and strategic bomber bases, but it's kind of silly to think that China would use balloons to collect that information over those sites when in the satellite era. Now, granted, you have more control over balloons with onboard motors, so you can loiter, whereas a satellite, which is in orbit, and has to crisscross the globe in a specific area to get as much information as you could gather in a balloon just sitting over a site for an hour, it'd take longer for that satellite. But assuming the Chinese aren't stupid people, which I don't think they are, I think they realize that loitering over sensitive sites such as nuclear sites or manufacturing sites or training sites would immediately bring force upon the balloon, and they didn't loiter; it just moved across. So, and the U.S. has said repeatedly they don't see this as a direct threat; they just see it as an infringement on U.S. sovereignty. Now, China is claiming the balloon is a weather balloon that went off track, but if you're China and you have a weather balloon that goes off track, you would think that you would notify the countries that it's gone off track. The path of the balloon went over Canada, which is kind of concerning because if they didn't do anything about it, or maybe they were aware of it and notified the U.S., and both the U.S. and Canada are conducting counterintelligence collection on the balloon. It's an opportunity. I mean, if you actually look at the balloon's path, it crosses Alaska first, then Canada. And it makes me think that the U.S. was likely aware of the balloon well in advance and has just been monitoring it silently until some civilians in Montana noticed it on February 1st. I think they were trying to see where the balloon went, keep it monitored, and if it ran its course and crossed sensitive areas, the U.S. was going to react diplomatically, as Anthony Blinken has. China has officially expressed regret over the civilian balloon moving into U.S. territory. They are claiming it is completely civilian in nature. And you know what? Maybe it is. But again, if you have a weather balloon that goes off course and you know you have somewhat of an adversarial stance against the U.S. as China, you might want to notify them. And again, maybe they did, and maybe we're not being told the whole story, because it's interesting that they're worried about damage to infrastructure and people. A lot of the places where they could have dropped this balloon are huge open areas. Again, you don't want to take the chance, I suppose, but I feel like that's a really weak excuse for what the real reason is they're conducting counterintelligence. Now, the reason I think this is also a nothing burger is because China has done this before. In February of last year, the U.S. scrambled jets to take a look at a mysterious balloon floating off the coast of Hawaii that had origins out of the South China Sea. In December of last year, a high-altitude airship was spotted near the Philippines And many of these weather balloons have been spotted over places such as India and Japan. Now, are they weather balloons? Again, I don't know. But it's a pretty, I guess, weak level of surveillance relative to the capable technology. I mean, this is a Cold War era tech. And perhaps China just doesn't have the capability to develop an adequate satellite intelligence system and infrastructure like the US has. But I got to think that if China were to float balloons, they'd have to know that those would be immediately detected and shot down. And the U.S. just doesn't see it as a big enough threat to shoot down. So I just don't think there's a lot to be concerned about over these balloons. I think if it is some sort of surveillance intelligence balloon, the U.S. is going to take the steps to protect the sites that the balloon would be crossing over, but also take the steps to probably conduct their own counterintelligence and collection actions against the balloon, which could potentially damage Chinese efforts to collect worse, because that you can largely determine what satellites these are being beamed back to, etc. So again, I don't think there's anything really big to worry about. I think that China and the Canada and the U.S. were aware of it. They just weren't saying anything, and the fact that it seemingly followed an erratic path that wouldn't have followed the jet stream per se. It ended up in over U.S. sites. The U.S. has a credible reason to think that it was a surveillance effort, and because of that, Antony Blinken has canceled trip to China. So that's my thoughts on it. Again, I don't think it's anything that we need to lose sleep over, because they've done this before. And our own officials are like, yeah, they flew over Montana's nuke sites, but I mean, what can you gather? You just look at the ground. They already have that intelligence at this point.